Today's panel is being moderated by a journalist who could discuss the topic of Syria and the Levant in her sleep. Kim Ghattas is the State Department correspondent for the BBC, who grew up in Lebanon, I should say Syrian-occupied Lebanon. She just returned from covering the Secretary of State John Kerry's travels around the Middle East, so she's very up to date on the latest policy ins and outs. She's also the author of the best-selling book, The Secretary, A Journey with Hillary Clinton from the Heart of American Power, which I suggest you read. It's a very good read. And you can learn more about her in our program book. So, Kim, I'd like to hand the panel over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, for the introduction. And thank you all very much for being here with us this morning for the second panel of the Middle East Institute yearly conference, Sectarianism and the Balkanization of the Levant. Now, in 1916, the French diplomat François-Georges Picot and the British adventurer and diplomatic advisor Mark Sykes came to a secret agreement that effectively divided the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire outside of the Arabian Peninsula into areas of future British and French control or influence. And that's how the borders of the modern Levant were born. And they have held since then. But 9 decades later, and 2 years into the Arab uprisings and 2 years into the Syrian civil war, people are reaching for their history books and declaring the end of the Sykes-Picot agreement. Are we really seeing the Arab world breaking apart to give way to new states defined by sect or ethnicity, replacing the old imperial borders? And how does sectarianism fit into this? Or is it driven, or is the Balkanization driven by sectarianism? And how do actors such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, and the US, of course, who are all fighting a proxy war inside Syria, how do they fit in to this dynamic? Now, the title does include the word Levant, but we're going to expand a little bit beyond the traditional borders of the Levant to include in the discussion Iran and Iraq, because we have a panel with us that brings a breadth of expertise and knowledge and on-the-ground expertise to discuss this very timely issue with us. I'll start with Paul Salem, who's to my left. He's just joined the Middle East Institute as their vice president for policy and research. He leads the Arab Transitions Initiative at the Middle East Institute. Before that, he was the founding director of the Carnegie Middle East Center. And in 2002, he also served on the Senior Review Committee for the UNDP's Arab Human Development Report. And just for full disclosure, he used to be my professor at the American University of Beirut, which is probably why I turned out kind of okay. His latest book is Broken Orders, The Causes and Consequences of the Arab Uprising. To Paul's left is Mona Yacoubian from the Stimson Center. She's the senior advisor of the Middle East program there with a focus on Arab uprisings and with a specific concentration on Syria. She's also the co-director of the Stimson U.S. Institute of Peace Lebanon Working Group. And she previously, from 1990 to 1997, served as North Africa analyst at the U.S. State Department. To Mona's left is Mohsen Milani from the University of South Florida. He's the executive director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies and professor of politics at the University of South Florida. He was previously a fellow at Harvard, Oxford, and Foscari universities. He has a book coming out on Iranian foreign policy, which should be a very interesting read, considering all the developments we're watching unfold today. And his previous book is The Making of Iran's Islamic Revolution. And at the very end of the table is Gregory Gause from University of Vermont, and also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Doha Center. He taught at Columbia University. He just told me that he was a Fulbright scholar in Kuwait, so he also speaks Arabic and has first-hand knowledge of the region. And his latest book is The International Relations of the Persian Gulf. Now, the title includes the words Balkanization and sectarianism. They are, of course, connected, but they're also a little bit separate. So what I want to do in this discussion is start with one and then see how that leads into the second part of the discussion. And I'm going to start with a question for Paul first. The way the discussion is going to go, I'm going to try to keep it interactive between the panelists as well. We'll have until about 11:30, 11:40 for a discussion here with the panel, and then we'll open the floor up to questions from the audience. But Paul, I want to start with you because you're from Lebanon, I'm from Lebanon, and we've lived through the war there, 15 years of civil war, where everybody at every turn, at every new breakout of the fighting predicted this is the end of the borders of Lebanon as we know it. We're going to be separated into cantons. It never really quite happened. Do you really think that the discussion about the end of the Sykes-Picot agreement is valid at this stage? And do you think that because we're in this phase of the Arab uprisings that it is a valid concern or a valid prediction?
Well, thank you, Kim. I think historically, when parts of the world face these kind of problems where populations no longer fit with the orders or the regimes that were governing them, usually there was a malleability in establishing new borders, new rulers emerging and announcing new regimes. But I think we're stuck with the borders we have, mainly because the international order, except in very exceptional circumstances like East Timor or the former Yugoslavia, that new borders require international acceptance. They're not simply self-announced, and I don't see any willingness in the regional power structure or the international power structure to announce and accept new official international borders. But what has happened is that the three nation states, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, have effectively collapsed as national projects. Lebanon effectively collapsed as a united nation in the 70s. Iraq over stages and then, is still kind of not a nation. It's broken. And Syria, over the past 2 years, has broken as a national project. In all three cases, also, the states are no longer sovereign. Lebanon doesn't control its borders, Syria doesn't, and Iraq doesn't, nor all of its territory. So we have broken nations and broken states in a border order, as it were, that is not open to change, and that perhaps is a problem. We are also passing through, we're also in a region which is terribly contested. The first panel today, we talked about Tunisia or Libya, or even Egypt is in a geostrategic environment which is not hotly contested. The Levant obviously is contested between Iraq and the Gulf, between Turkey and Arab countries, between the U.S., Russia, and China to some degree. You see it in Syria, you saw it in Lebanon, you see it in Iraq today. So not only are these sort of broken nations and broken states, the region itself, in a sense, is a proxy war zone. And until, the regional conflicts or regional negotiations take place, I don't think we'll see any major progress. And to end sectarian conflict, just take that as an example, effectively is geostrategic competition between Iran and the Gulf, taking sect as a marker. Mm-hmm. In the 50s, the Cold War created huge conflict in the region between leftists. And the Communist Party in Iraq was the strongest and so on. So the markers of identity or politics are not necessarily the genuine drivers. And that's why my only hope is if we could get regional negotiations stabilizing the regional conflict, then the local conflicts are much easier handled.
Let me bring in Mona, because of course everybody's very focused on Syria. When we have this discussion about borders, we're very focused on Syria. We heard today, or I think it was yesterday, the Kurds declaring self-rule. We have all these rumors about President Assad and his Alawite sect declaring perhaps a statelet that gives them access to the sea, but also remains connected to Lebanon somehow and their connection with Hezbollah. How do you see this play out? Do you really think that we're watching Syria break into small statelets?
Thanks, Kim, and thanks to the Middle East Institute also for having me. Like Paul, I think Balkanization and the idea of the breakup of the Levant, let alone the breakup of Syria, I think that's an exaggeration. It makes for great copy, and are we witnessing the collapse of the post-Ottoman order, etc.? So I don't see it in such extreme terms. However, I do think if we take a step back, and try and understand what is happening to Syria in the broader context of the Arab uprisings, I think it provides for us two very important insights. One is that the Arab uprisings writ large, from my perspective, are characterized by a breakdown of the old order. In the case of Syria, it is the breakdown of the Assad-led authoritarian regime. We don't know yet what is going to come in its stead, and I would argue we won't know for many, many years. The second key element, I think, of the Arab uprisings that has particular relevance to understanding Syria is, from my perspective, the Arab uprisings really also underscore the changing nature of power. That power has become more diffuse, and we could have a much longer discussion about why and how that is. Is it because of technology, or what are the various aspects? But for me, that was a very big takeaway when it first started, is that we really, I think, as analysts, I would say personally, didn't appreciate what was happening on the peripheries of society, and the ways in which change was fermenting at that level. And I believe it continues. In the Syrian case, the diffusion of power, I think, manifests as sectarian, a deeper sectarian sentiment. In Libya, it would be maybe deeper tribalism. But in Syria, I think it's a deeper sectarian sentiment. And so there, I think, that's, to me, the connection between this idea of Balkanization and sectarianism. I don't see Syria's external borders changing. But I also think I don't see Syria ever going back to what it was pre-uprising.
So what we might be seeing is actually the creation of sectarian enclaves within the actual borders.
That's exactly right. I mean, we're already seeing de facto soft partition. We're seeing, and I don't think it's been well documented, it's anecdotally documented, we're seeing the movement of communities along ethnic and sectarian lines, so that communities that were minorities in a particular area, for example, around Banyas on the coast, there are some Sunni villages that have been the victims of massacres. That has led to the outpouring of Sunnis in that area. We're seeing Shia villages elsewhere in the north that have been emptied. So we're seeing the movement of people. And then I think the other exception in some ways to all of this is the Kurdish issue, because there I think it is much more of a cohesive movement. And this declaration the other day of a transitional government, to my mind, that's a significant move insofar as you see amongst the Kurds a much more cohesive movement toward declaring what it is that they want. But no, they're not asking for a separate Kurdistan. I think what we will see is something akin to the Kurdish Republic in Iraq, a similar kind of analog in Syria, where there's a great deal of autonomy, but it's still part of Syria.
I want to bring in Mohsen with your expertise of Iran and that view from Iran towards the conflict in Syria. What is Tehran's view of the evolving conflict and the borders of the region? How do they see this conflict play out? And what is essential to them? Is it the survival of Syria as it is? Is it the survival of Assad? And then I'll move on to Greg, and then I'd like to get a conversation started between all of you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to the Middle East Institute for organizing this great conference. I believe that we are on the verge of a major transformation in the Middle East. But it is a kind of transformation that defies what the conventional wisdom has been telling us about. I think two events are most likely to influence the future of the Middle East, more so than the Arab Spring and the sectarian civil war inside Syria. One is the possibility of a U.S.-Iran rapprochement. If my analysis is correct, that both Tehran and Washington have agreed that some sort of rapprochement must take place between the two countries in the next few years. That is going to change the calculation of every single country in that region. And I think along with Israel and Turkey, I see these three players as the major drivers of the politics of the Middle East.
And it might also decrease sectarianism.
I'll get to that in a second. Yes. And the second event that is taking place, and it's been taking place quietly, is the re-entry of Russia into the Middle Eastern politics. Russia is already an ally of Iran. It has become a major player in Syria. And I think they are about to take advantage of the chaos in Egypt and try to re-enter the Middle Eastern politics. Now, how does Tehran look at what is happening in the Levant? Well, first of all, I think Iran is going to fight to the bitter end to defend Assadism in Syria. In other words, although Iran has invested heavily to support Bashar al-Assad, they will continue to do so. But I think the fact that we have a moderate and pragmatic government in Iran, in Hassan Rouhani, I can see the possibility that if the rapprochement with the U.S. proceeds, Iran might agree to a situation in which Assad is removed from power as long as the military and the intelligence apparatus of the Syrian state does not collapse. In other words, something similar to what has taken place in Egypt. I am one of those who never believed we've had a revolution in Egypt. I think what we have had is social and political upheaval, but the fundamental reality of Egypt has not changed, and that is the military is the major driver. I think the Iranians are willing to entertain that possibility. And finally, about sectarianism, I think there is a great deal of exaggeration about the role of sectarianism. I think sectarianism does play a major role in the Middle East, but it becomes important only and only when it is intertwined with the state as the major player in the Middle East, as well as with nationalism. In other words, the unit of analysis for understanding the Middle East today is not sectarianism, but is state competition. For example, in the Persian Gulf, in the Levant, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which have been involved in a vicious Cold War for the past few years, and both of them are the driver of sectarianism in Syria. But they're driving sectarianism not because of their religious differences, but because this is the most effective weapon they have to push their agenda.
Greg, you've written recently about new sectarianism in the region and how it actually is more about political context. It's not just about Sunnis versus Shias, but it's also a political tool. So I wonder whether you agree with Mohsen, but also if you could first answer another question that I have for you. Is it less about borders in the region? Are people contesting the borders? If they are, I don't know if you agree with the premise of Balkanization, or is it really about being accepted as equal citizens in a country, whether you are a minority that is being oppressed by the majority or a majority ruled by a minority? Because at the onset in Syria, this was not a sectarian civil war. This was a popular uprising by people who felt that they were being oppressed.
I think that the fundamental driver of the entire upheavals of the Arab world in 2011 was this demand for, bread and dignity, equality of citizenship, greater economic and fairer economic prospects. Those dynamics play themselves out very differently in different places. For me, the starting point of understanding the Fertile Crescent or the Mashriq or whatever we want to call it is the breakdown of the state in Syria and Iraq. And that predates, of course, the Arab Spring. The United States, as a matter of policy, destroyed the state in Iraq after the state had been weakened through sanctions and the stupidity of the government of Iraq. But Syria and Iraq had, I think we could say, had state building projects going on, right, from the 60s. These were ugly and authoritarian and violent, but that's not so unusual in the history of state building. Right? Henry VIII and Cardinal Richelieu were not nice people, right? But they built centralized states. that project has failed. It's failed. And that, to me, is where sectarianism comes from. When the state can no longer provide security, basic security. You go to the communities that you feel can provide security for you. And that's largely sectarian, although ethnic in the Kurdish areas in the Mashriq. We don't see that in a place like Jordan because the state challenged earlier in a fierce civil war, right, survived and built itself. Right? And we talk about why Jordan didn't have upheaval, didn't have regime change in the Arab Spring. The experience of that civil war and the victory of the state and the building of state authority, I think, is an ignored element to that. So, yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with Paul and Mona and Mohsen. Unfortunately, I'd like to disagree with them because it's more fun. But no,
I'll
I
try to make you clash a bit later on.
Good. I don't think this is about redrawing the borders a la the former Yugoslavia into independent sovereign states. Paul's absolutely right. Right? The borders of this part of the world were drawn by international actors, and I don't see any international actors who have an interest in redrawing those borders in the short term or even the medium term. But I think that what we're seeing is the end of state authority from the Iranian border to the Mediterranean. And we can go into Palestine as well. And I think that that's going to be a reality that's going to define the dynamics of regional politics for some time.
I must just explain that I've come back from this trip with John Kerry feeling quite under the weather, but I was absolutely intent on being here today, so forgive me if I cough every now and then. And I'm not really crying because of the state of the region, because I'm trying to suppress my cough. But let me just come back to you, Mona, and Paul, and ask you, why are we seeing all these articles in the Western press about the end of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, about redrawing of maps in the region? I mean, it strikes me as though, just like the map was drawn at the time by the West is now looking at the region and thinking, oh, perhaps it's time to redraw the maps again. But not a single person that I've spoken to in the Arab world has ever told me that they want to belong to a different kind of country, that they want the borders of their country to be redrawn.
I mean, as I said before, I think, why is the West playing it this way? It's compelling. I mean, it's a very compelling story to talk about the collapse of the post-Ottoman era, to kind of heighten the notion of the artificiality of the borders as they were drawn under Sykes-Picot, and to look at, in a way, it speaks to Syria's geostrategic centrality in all of this. Because what's really happened, it's not so much that the borders are collapsing, it's that Syria is collapsing, in the sense of this regime now.
But within its borders.
But within its borders. And as Syria collapsing, or the order in Syria collapsing. As I said, as part of, I draw analytically a line between what's happened in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt to Syria. I believe these are different manifestations of the same core phenomenon, which is this drive for change in the Arab world. But if I could just for a moment, so we can spark a little debate on this question of sectarianism and whether or not it is a dynamic that is fueled from on high or from above, whether it's because of the breakdown of the state, as Greg puts it, and I find that very compelling, that when state institutions break down, people then turn to their clan, their community for protection. I think there's certainly something to that. I less buy the argument that the rise of sectarianism in Syria is purely the result of a proxy battle of outside actors. I do think it's a factor, and I think it's critical to tamping down the violence in Syria, that there be more discussion amongst the regional players, in particular Saudi Arabia and Iran. But I want to just go back for a moment to this idea of the diffusion of power. And I think to understand the complexity of this sectarian dynamic in Syria, it's important to think not only about the breakdown of the state and state institutions, but also the bubbling up of the grassroots. And again, whether it's through identity politics, whether it's through some kind of identification more as sect or clan, to me, there is also at the heart of this an existential element. So when one's fears are based on who I am as sect or ethnicity, it very quickly becomes existential.
It's about survival.
It's about survival. And that, in turn, I would argue, then has an impact on both the vicious cycle that is then started as a result of this, the fact that the stakes are so high, that they are in fact existential. Whether or not they truly are, it's the perception, and that's all that matters. And so and therefore, last point, I think what ends up happening is we have a cycle that becomes self-perpetuating and is, frankly, in my opinion, no longer in the control of elites. And I think we're seeing it in Syria very clearly.
So it's bottom-up and top-down.
It's both.
And Paul, where do you stand on that? Do you agree with Mona, or do you agree with Greg? Or somehow with both? You're somewhere in the middle?
Well, let me comment on the Sykes-Picot perspective, see if I agree or disagree. But, I mean, what's relevant about, remembering the Sykes-Picot moment is not so much what happened then. We're under completely different conditions. But this part of the world, call it the Levant or whatever you want to call it, is the most conflicted region in the world. It houses...
That's why I'm crying.
It houses the top 4 or 5 wars of the world. The Arab-Israeli conflict, which has been going on forever, which had a lot to do with the collapse of Lebanon, with the invasion of Iraq, with chemical weapons deals in Syria. The Iranian GCC war, proxy war, Cold War, is a major one. The war on terror, both internationally towards the region and within the region, is a major one. It also obviously houses the world's main energy reserves. So this is not a normal region. This is also a region that was born 90 years ago by ripping out 500 years of Turkish government. So, it was an unusual birth. And then later ripping out French and British mandates. So this is not like Egypt or Brazil or other parts. So there's a very, it's a super troubled place. And the regional and international conflict aspect effectively is what tore apart Lebanon and Syria. And of course, Lebanon had its huge internal problems. Syria and Iraq did. But, the pressures from these wars and conflicts were decisive in all cases. That's, as a policy perspective, I conclude that until the region is stabilized somewhat, it's very unrealistic to expect a few, Syrian groups or Iraqi groups or Lebanese groups to be able to build viable nation states while 3 or 4 major wars rage over them, in them, and around them. This obviously means the Arab-Israeli conflict. It means maybe more hopefully Iran-Western rapprochement that might lead to some Iranian GCC accommodation, which would be key. That's why I think when we talk about Sykes-Picot, of course, that was a moment in history, but regional agreements and negotiation and international negotiation and agreement over the stabilizing of the Levant is necessary and is key, and without it, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, and maybe sparks in Bahrain and Yemen and other places, this will not be resolved. It does require international agreement. And the U.S., with all of its, maybe decline in power and so on, both militarily and diplomatically remains the most powerful and influential player, in the world and in the region. It's no longer, the sole power.
But there is a lot of pushback at the moment by the Saudis,
of course,
by the Israelis.
Which is in the nature of politics. But I mean to say, and here we are in Washington, because this region requires regional and international negotiation and stabilization, and the U.S. has a large role to play, which means reaching out to the Russians, talking with the Saudis, bringing in the Iranians. Diplomacy and politics and the tools of power and diplomacy must be used to stabilize this region. Sitting back and saying, well, the Syrians will talk about it and figure it out in Geneva, or let's, have Maliki figure it out by himself, or let's have, Hassan Nasrallah and Najib Mikati and Michel Sleiman try to work at it. That's totally unrealistic. It requires a major regional stabilization.
We'll talk about Syria in a second. And if you want to interject or disagree, please go ahead. Greg, you want to say something?
I disagree with Greg, but I can't.
I definitely want to disagree with Paul. First off, this is the Middle East Institute, so let's be smart. The way that you can tell everybody, right, that you are a real Middle East type is you don't talk about the end of Sykes-Picot. You talk about the end of San Remo, because that's where the borders were actually drawn. If the borders were drawn by Sykes and Picot, Mosul would be part of Syria. So that's how you identify yourself as an insider and pass my class. All right. Secondly,
I don't belong in your class.
Right. Secondly, I think that Paul and Mohsen are both getting a little ahead of themselves when they talk about an Iranian-American rapprochement. It seems to me that the nuclear issue on the table is something in which a deal can be done. But, with all sorts of obstacles.
We're not there yet.
We're not there yet, but it's possible. Translating that into a larger geopolitical bargain in the region, I think, is extremely difficult, because the United States is not about to sanction, despite the fears of the Gulf states. Right? The United States is not about to sanction a leading Iranian role in the Levant. Right? The two fundamental interests that continue to drive American policy, right, are the relationship with Israel and our desire to maintain our dominance in the Persian Gulf. Right? Both drive against any kind of deal where the United States would, in essence, turn over the keys of the region to Iran, which is the big fear in the Gulf, less in Israel. Right? So I fear that if the settling down of this region requires an American-Iranian deal or a Saudi-Iranian deal, we're going to be waiting a long time for that. And I'm no more optimistic than Paul is that the local parties in the current atmosphere can get themselves together and actually do a deal on the ground and present it to the regional powers. I'm not optimistic about that, but I'm also very pessimistic that there could be, in the short term, some kind of geopolitical deal by the outsiders that would stabilize the place.
I want to bring in Mohsen indeed, because you raised the issue of the U.S.-Iranian rapprochement initially, and I want to have your thoughts both on what Greg said, but also I want to explore the idea that, President Rouhani at the moment, the president of Iran, was an aide to Rafsanjani back in the day when he was president, and he helped improve ties with Saudi Arabia at the time. Do you see a way by which this could be replicated again this time, thereby decreasing sectarian tensions between Sunnis and Shias? Because there is that big clash apparently happening in the region. And also, I was just with John Kerry on this trip. I interviewed him in Abu Dhabi, and going back to your point, Greg, the enmity between the US and Iran is about much more than just the nuclear program. How do you resolve that? And I was somewhat astounded when Mr. Kerry said that Syria was a 30-second discussion with Mr. Zarif. Either they feel that they should be very much focused for now just on the details of the nuclear agreement, or they haven't quite figured out how you do come to some sort of geopolitical arrangement with Iran if you get through this nuclear deal. So why don't you tell us what you think, Mohsen?
I usually try not to disagree with people who are bigger than me. But this time I have to.
Especially right on your border.
That's right. When I was talking
I'll
about...
I'll protect you.
Yes.
With the Lebanese, we have lots of ways of doing things.
No, I can. I'm small, but I'm fast. I talked about the possibility of a rapprochement. 33 years of mutual animosity and a hidden war between the U.S. and Iran is not going to disappear overnight. The reason why I said the possibility of rapprochement is that nobody in Iran is talking about normal relations with the U.S., not even President Rouhani. what they have talked about is creating a situation in which the U.S. and Iran can manage their disagreements. It is more a management of conflict than normalization of relations. These are two different things. Moreover, the question of nuclear agreement is one thing, and I think there is great deal of agreement inside Iran that there should be an agreement. But the question of normalization with the U.S., it is an entirely different thing. I, for example, believe Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, is made up his mind in that he does want to have the resolution of the nuclear issue. But regarding normalizing relations with the U.S., I don't think he has made up his mind. So what I'm talking about, the possibility of a rapprochement, not that the two countries become friends again, but the possibility that the two countries can actually begin to talk about different issues, which take me to the Syrian crisis.
And Hezbollah.
Look, if we keep saying that Iran is the number one supporter of Assad, which it is true, Russia is the number one international supporter of Assad, but Iran is the number one regional supporter of Assad. You cannot have peace in Syria without including Iran in these negotiations. Whatever type of negotiation goes on, it is just not realistic to talk about this. The fact that Zarif and Kerry talked about Syria for 30 seconds is fantastic. So now they have talked 30 more seconds than they did 6 months ago.
Always look on the bright side.
And that is the good beginning. Look, the crisis in Syria is no longer part of the so-called Arab Spring. It has become much more complicated. There is the struggle between Assad and his opposition. Then there is the sectarian element to it. I think the Christians and other minorities are very wise to look at Iraq and see what happened when the state collapsed in Iraq. They are not going to support the opposition as long as they think there is a possibility of repetition of Iraq in Syria. And finally, believe it or not, there are regional players as well as international players who are involved directly in the Syrian crisis. Therefore, the solution to the Syrian crisis, A, is political, and B, is engagement of all of these players in terms of resolution. And finally, to your question about Saudi Arabia and Iran, you are absolutely right. Rafsanjani opened a direct channel to the king when he was president and after he was president. And I believe Mr. Rouhani desperately wants to restore good relationship with Saudi Arabia. I think his government is prepared to do this. I am not very sure if the Saudi government at this time is prepared to do so, precisely because they are so scared of a possibility, forget about normalization, of a possibility that the Americans begin to talk about Syria for 30 seconds with the foreign minister of the country who is the single greatest regional supporter of Syria.
And I don't disagree with that, but the situation on the ground is very different from the time of the Rafsanjani opening to Saudi, right? At that time, Iraq was not a client state of Iran. Syria was an ally of Iran, but the Saudis still had some hope of maybe, drawing the Assad regime back into the Arab fold, quote unquote. The only place where Iran was dominant in the Mashriq at that time was Lebanon, right? Now the situation is, from the Saudi perspective, is extremely different because I think that the Saudis, since 2005, have seen the rollback of Iranian influence in the region as their major goal, and they have failed utterly. The only place where they think that they have a chance to accomplish that is Syria, and so far they're failing there too.
Mona and Paul, can I get you to talk a little bit about how sectarianism fits into the regional power play between Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia and, let's say, Qatar and the Emirates on the other, and of course the US would be in that camp. Does it play off sectarianism? Does it feed sectarianism? Is it purely sectarian? Is it geopolitical? Is it a combination?
It's yes to everything just asked. I mean, I think it's extraordinarily complex, and I think what's happened is Syria really is has become the arena of competition between these regional powers that are both feeding into and feeding off of this sectarian dynamic that, again, I would argue has taken on a life of its own and is evolving in ways that state powers, in my opinion, simply cannot control. And so you have things like, you have, for example, the statement by Hassan Nasrallah yesterday, we are in Syria, we will stay in Syria, and he defines it, frankly, in sectarian terms. He talks about the takfirist threat, which is, in my study of Hezbollah, this notion of takfirism as being a threat is relatively new in their rhetoric. And so if you look at Hezbollah as being, in some ways, I think it's too simplistic to say a projection of Iran's influence, but certainly that side of the divide's projection of power into Syria. By the same token, we have documented evidence of the Gulf powers, whether as states or in private flows, sending arms and men and finances, etc., to their clients, if you will, in Syria. From my perspective, it's all the more reason why I actually here agree with Mohsen that we, the United States, I think needs to, at some point, begin to include Iran in discussions about Syria. And I would actually argue, if I could talk for just a second, about Geneva, Geneva II, which is still very much front and center, and the U.S. is hoping that we get the Syrian protagonists around the table, perhaps by mid-December. My sense is that is premature, and the real strategy, so that diplomacy does not fail in Syria, is to lower our sights a bit and have the great powers, the U.S. and Russia, together with key regional powers, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, bring those key players around the table to talk about how to de-escalate the situation in Syria as a way of creating conditions on the ground that going forward will be more propitious for negotiations. I don't think the Syrian parties are there yet, but I do think it's not too early to start de-escalating, and I think in some ways this opening to Iran creates that possibility.
Paul, do you want to jump in and perhaps talk to us a little bit from your perspective, our perspective as people who lived through the conflict in Lebanon, where, conflict, as Mona says, often takes on a life of its own. Sectarianism is used by the people at the top, but then it becomes a dynamic on the ground that is very difficult to stop. And very often for a war to end, unfortunately, it has to kind of play itself out. How do you see things developing in Syria, and where does the regional rivalry between the Sunni monarchies and Iran fit into that, and how do you bring them together?
Well, I think it's very true that once blood begins to flow and people fear for their lives, community, and hence simple forms of community, which historically in our part of the world was sect or ethnic community or tribe, if you look at other parts of the Middle East, takes over because you're simply trying to survive rather than trying to promote a particular point of view. But I would also caution against the assumption that, this part of the world in crisis will always revert to sectarianism. If we look at the major turning points, whether it was, World War I or World War II, Turkish, post-Turkish, and then post, in very historic moments in these societies, identities either were at some points very nationalistic or very much on the left-right spectrum. So there are other possibilities. Now, for several reasons, we might be passing through an unfortunate period in Middle Eastern history. Maybe it has to do with world history, the demise of socialism, even the demise of nationalism as a great project, that people fall back on sectarianism. But certainly, for whatever set of reasons, we are currently in a highly sectarian period in the Levant. That's partly because of domestic dynamics and sociology, but a lot of it is because the two petropowers are effectively sectarian states, in the sense that's how they're set up. They have an ideology which is religious and sectarian, and they have a foreign policy that promotes it through finance, through guns, through media, through all kinds of modes. And it's also the fact that the players in the Levant, who maybe previously would have gone to Washington or Moscow as their main supporters, as they did in the 50s and 60s, they still do, marginally, but you can get much more in Tehran or much more in Riyadh than you can today in Moscow or in Washington. And that very much colors the situation. So unfortunately, yes, we are in a fragmented Levant, and as Greg said, what I was saying that in order to solve it, these things have to happen. Am I optimistic that they are going to happen? No. So I see this as a decades-long crisis, unfortunately. To look for a bit of silver lining and to, push a bit on the issue of what if, the Rouhani government and the Saudi government have a bit of a rapprochement themselves, regardless of what happens with the U.S. Those could be silver linings. Lebanon coexisted with, throughout the 90s and up till 2005 with major Saudi and Iranian power coexisting in the country reasonably well. Without going into the details, the resolution of some of the crises in Lebanon in 2008, it was Qatar, who had good relations with Iran and sort of okay relations with Saudi Arabia, that put together a deal that brought a brief period of conflict to an end. What I mean is that the disease is there. This region is fragmented. The main petrostates that are projecting power in the region really are not supporting the nation states in any of these cases, but are supporting subnational actors. That is why this region will probably not stabilize or heal. However, to find temporary endings or patchwork to the Syrian, what could be a Syrian crisis which could be livable is now an open-ended civil war, displacing millions and killing hundreds of thousands. With patchwork, you can reduce the cost, you can reduce the conflict. More deals could be made over Iraq. So the system is broken, but through, we could stumble through this period if Iran and Saudi Arabia, despite their systemic destabilization, could have agreements that could keep Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria at least limping along without killing hundreds of thousands of people.
And very briefly, Paul, because then I want to wrap up with a question for each one of you, and we'll start taking questions from the audience if you want to start getting ready with that. I know it sounds perhaps counterintuitive because, Lebanon has so many of its own problems, but is there anything to learn from Lebanon's experience for the region? When the war started in Lebanon, the Sunni community still wanted to be part of Syria, for example. By the end of the war, I think, peace was tenuous, but there was one thing everybody could agree with, is that they actually wanted to be part of Lebanon. They didn't want to be part of any other country anymore. And we have learned the difficult lessons of coexistence, even though we remain a deeply sectarian society. What are the lessons there, perhaps?
Well, I think, what's happening in Syria and Iraq really is not contesting the borders. It's contesting the role of, the condition of citizens and so on in Syria and Iraq, and the role of the situation of different communities at another level. Lebanon went through the communal issue. Lebanon always sort of had a high level of freedom and so on. We didn't have a problem with sort of authoritarian rule, but we had a problem with communal power sharing. I think the lesson that can be learned from Lebanon is nobody wins a civil war. Everybody loses a civil war. And that even though you will distrust or might distrust and might continue to distrust and maybe dislike the other community, I'm not saying you should, I'm saying people do, that you can share power, you can coexist, and you can move forward. It's not a very stable or successful model, but it beats massive civil war, which we went through. We had that experience of trying to to win a civil war or trying to, take advantage in that way, which Syria is going through now, which Iraq in different forms is in a way still going through. But, the Lebanese communities, people, some of the leaders did realize that nobody's going to win this. Let's be part of the pie rather than trying to break it apart. And I think those are some lessons that might be useful to Syria.
Very
today.
briefly, starting with Greg and then coming back to Paul, very briefly, 30 seconds. How do you overcome sectarianism at this stage in the region and avoid the prospect of Balkanization, depending on how you define it and whether you agree or not that it is a prospect? But let's focus on how do you overcome sectarianism at this stage. Greg.
Short term, it does require agreement by outside powers, as difficult as that is. Long term, you build states.
Mohsen?
I think he said it all. I can't add anything, and I'm very sad about it, but I can't add anything.
What about you, Mona?
I can embellish. I mean, basically, I think Syria right now is the fulcrum of this sectarian tension, and I think therefore it is incumbent on those in the region and the global powers to first come together and make a decision that the stalemate that prevails in Syria, which is what it is not tenable over a long period of time, given the humanitarian catastrophe, given the rise of jihadism and foreign fighters in the country, and given the very disproportionate and negative spillover economically on Lebanon and Jordan in particular. And so I think it is absolutely has to be a decision by regional and global powers. And then ultimately, I think the Levant must come upon a formula, a way to understand how to contend with its plural and diverse societies, which I believe ultimately are an asset, not a liability. But the region, through its Ottoman period, colonial period, and in the case of Syria, authoritarian period, has never happened upon how to do that.
Paul, 15 seconds.
I agree with what Greg said and my other colleagues said. Just to make a link to the first panel, I mean, some people in Lebanon, Syria, and elsewhere did look to Egypt in this last. Egypt doesn't have a lot of geostrategic power and money and guns to pull out, but had Egypt, elaborated a successful new Arab model of governance, which was, somewhat democratic and so on, it might have had some kind of pull in terms of a model. But given its current failure or stumbling, that reinforces sectarianism all the more.
Before we go to questions, Mohsen, you wanted to make a last point?
1 minute intervention. Since you corrected our colleagues about the drawing of the map of the Middle East and when it happened, let me just see if I can ask you to whether you were accurate to say that Iraq has become a client state of Iran. I'm not a fan of Mr. Maliki, but I think to call Iraq a client state of Iran is exaggeration. And I just want to make one central point about Iraq, which I think people do not pay enough attention to. The animosity between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the real animosity started after U.S. troops liberated Iraq. From that moment, I think Saudi Arabia lost its most important ally in containing Iranian so-called Persian expansionism. And I submit to you that Syria is not the center of gravity in the competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Syria is important for Iran not because Syria is important. It's important because through Syria, Iran can empower Hezbollah. Hezbollah is Iran's king in the game of chess. But the most important country for Iran right now is Iraq, because Iraq is the second most important producer of oil, and a political alliance between Iran and Iraq is going to undermine Saudi Arabia in a way that no other two countries can undermine.
So perhaps not a client state, but definitely more Iranian influence than American influence inside Iraq.
I am not willing to say that. All I can say that Iran has become a major player in Iraq.
That's the status of the Middle East relationship. It's complicated.
Everything is complicated, but Nouri al-Maliki is prime minister of Iraq because of Iran.
All right. Let's go to questions. We have 2 microphones on either side of the room, and we'll start on this side because you're already lined up nicely. If you could please introduce yourself. Make sure you address the question to someone on the panel if you want to do so, and keep it brief, please. Go ahead.
I'm Peter Humphrey, a former diplomat and current intelligence analyst. I want to challenge the whole panel, basically. Sudan and Yugoslavia suggest that the vector of human history is self-determination, and there will not be peace until there is a routine process for people to stand up, demand a plebiscite, and have the world respect the results of that plebiscite. That is the vector of human history. How can we live in a situation in which there are 4 or 5 times more Kurds in the world than Palestinians, but the Palestinians deserve a state and the Kurds don't? That's insane.
Who wants to take that? All of you?
Yeah, no, I'm yeah.
Okay.
Can I quick
Well, it's big.
I agree on that the Kurdish issue is, for them, a Kurdish national independence issue. And I personally agree with all of that, and I think that is a dynamic that will continue on the vector towards attempts at independence. But I think what we were commenting on, the sectarian issues in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, for those who are conducting these sectarian groups and conflicts, they're not demanding national, a new border for their sect. They are demanding a role in the state that exists, for better or for worse. So I think the Kurdish national issue is exactly as you describe it, but the Sunni and Shi'i and Christian wars and problems are not wars for national independence. They're wars for other things.
But Peter raises an interesting point, which is, the interference of players abroad. At what point does the region just say, this is how we are going to solve our own problems, and we're not going to call on the US or on Russia to come and sort it out for us? Greg?
I look forward to that day.
Me too.
Yeah.
Do you want to tackle the Kurdish issue?
No, I think my guess is that the Kurds, if in a free vote, would of course vote for self-determination, and I think they would vote for it in the KRG. They would vote for it in a broader Kurdish referendum that crossed the borders. There's no international support for that. The Kurdish leadership in Erbil realizes that, and they've played this a very prudent game. My guess is that if you had votes in Lebanon, Arab Iraq, and Syria, you had a free vote, no one would vote to secede.
Mm-hmm. And of course, South Sudan got a lot of support from the U.S. That was one of the driving forces.
And no one cares about South Sudan.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's no international interest in South Sudan the way there is.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you, but I would add one other element. Whether the Kurds deserve to have a state or not, that's one thing. Right. Whether they're going to have it or not is entirely different. I don't think they're going to have it for a foreseeable future, not because the international players are not that interested, but much more importantly, the 3 major countries where Kurds are major player, Syria, Iran, and Turkey, especially Iran and Turkey, will not allow. This is the red line for Iran. It's the red line with Turkey. And I want to see what international power is willing to take a chance to alienate both Iran as well as a member of NATO to give sovereignty to the Kurds.
I'm going to stick to this side because they were standing there first. Please go ahead, sir.
Yes, my name is Dan Kohansky. I'm with the State Department, and my question is really directed to the whole panel because it seems to me that the panel as a whole has tiptoed around talking about one of the major regional players in the Levant, and that, of course, is Israel. And while Israel probably cannot force an agreement or suggest an agreement, they certainly have the power to sabotage an agreement, and they have legitimate interests in the outcome of the Syrian civil war. So how do you propose to bring Israel, or at least Israel's concerns, to the table in a way that will keep Israel from sabotaging any such agreement without at the same time alienating the other people?
Are you talking about the Iran-U.S. nuclear agreement? Or
no, I'm talking about the Syrian civil war.
Syrian civil war.
Right. We can talk about the Iran-U.S. agreement, or lack of it thereof, but that's another question.
Okay. Mona, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that the Israelis have been very clear about signaling that they have no interest in inserting themselves into the complexity of the Syrian civil war. What they have indicated through their actions, as much as through what they say, is that they have some very clear lines that they have defined that are defined by Israeli security concerns, and those lines largely are defined by the transfer of sophisticated weaponry from the Syrian regime to Hezbollah. And whenever they believe that that red line is crossed, they act. And they've done it, I think, 5 times thus far this year. But personally, my sense is I don't think the Israelis have any interest or desire to insert themselves into an eventual agreement in Syria. I think for them, it's what would be more important is to ensure that whatever the end game is in Syria, Israel's security concerns are respected.
Next question, please. Go ahead.
Janab Tutunji, George Washington University. I want to thank the panel for a very intelligent discussion, but I would suggest perhaps that the word sectarianism is being used a bit flippantly. There's a distinction between ethnogenesis and ethnic conflict. We're talking about ethnic conflict. We're not talking about how these different entities came to form political interests and political rivalries. So, for instance, if you look at Iraq, you want to analyze the Sunni Shiite conflict, you can go back to 1920, you can go back to the revolt of 1935, you can go back to the Qasim era, the revolts after the first Gulf War, etc., etc. Lebanon, there's a long history, going back at least to the 19th century, of different sectarian ethnic formations taking place.
Greg, would you like... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I would suggest perhaps one question we should ask is, we seem to be focusing on Syria as a model for understanding sectarian conflict, and we're talking about state interests, strategic interests, motivating sectarian conflict. Is Syria a unique case, or is it the model that applies to others?
Greg, go ahead.
Thanks.
Didn't seem sincere.
Yeah.
I
don't really have an answer to that because, in this context, we can't get into the deep history of any of these places. I think everybody on this panel pretty much knows that history, but also knows that we can't really get into it here. The Syria model, no. Each of these entities is unique, and the politics of it is going to work out. Are there, in different ways, are there commonalities that might give us some comparative leverage? Yes, I think there are. I think there are commonalities among the states whose regimes have been shaken or fallen by the events of the Winter of Arab Discontent in 2011 that can fruitfully be compared. And the way that these states have broken down is not always sectarian. Libya, I think, is a place also without a state. I think that, it's really interesting that in the first panel we talked a lot about the army in Egypt, right? And the army in Tunisia less so, but we talked about that. You cannot talk about an army anymore in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq. They're rebuilding one, but is it a national army or is it an army of a particular party or regime? And in Lebanon, of course, the army is maybe third or fourth in terms of military might in the well, at least it's not first.
At least second.
Yeah, maybe it's second, right? So I think that it's useful to be able to compare these entities and the political processes that are working themselves out, recognizing that each one of them has the details are unique. I think that's all I can say about that.
Paul, you wanted to say something.
To add some, we talk about the Syrian situation as a sectarian conflict, and now it is, perhaps, in large measure. But as you said, Kim, in the beginning, it didn't start out that way. And the main dynamic was not a sectarian conflict. This was the dynamic of a population demanding, something quite reasonable. If you look at Hezbollah is not... Hezbollah is a deterrent for Iran. In its geostrategic function, I sometimes call it's the aircraft carrier. The U.S. can park an aircraft carrier in the Gulf to threaten Iran. Iran can park Hezbollah on the border of northern Israel to deter. Now, it happens to be Shiite, and they use that mobilization. But so the cores of these conflicts are not sectarian. The tools often are.
Because sectarianism or your religious identity in the Middle East, it's more about communal identity sometimes and less about how deeply you believe in your faith. Is that
and
fair?
Identity is not a problem. Problems are problems. Oppression is a problem. War is a problem. Poverty is a problem. Identity is, it's your identity. And it's what's happened in the Middle East is that, take the Syrian case. The Syrian regime did everything it could, including facilitating the rise of Jabhat al-Nusra and others, to make sure that they changed the discussion from governance, poverty, social justice, accountability, to, some crazy jihadis are going to come kill us all, so we have to fight. They put a lot of effort.
And we are better than the jihadis, so
well,
keep
it's
us
not
in
hard
power.
to be better than the jihadis, yes, perhaps.
But that's the argument they make, right?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
What I mean is that, these are being turned into the language of identity politics. But the problems, there's no problem with being a Sunni, because indeed, except for some radical, Islamist groups, they're not, the major conflict is not out to proselytize. It's not a religious war. It's geostrategic, political, economic conflicts that use these identity markers to mobilize people and fight for interests.
If I may, just before we take the next question, Mohsen, I actually wanted to bring you in. How does it look like from the Iranian perspective, the sort of the Sunni-Shia divide?
Before I answer this, I think the point that you made is absolutely accurate about Syria. The Syrian conflict did not start because the Sunnis and the Alawites or Christians didn't get along. It started because of the demand for dignity and democracy, but then as the state was weakened, these ethnic groups began to compete. Iran today is a country of about 80 million people. About 51% is Persian. The other 49% belong to different ethnic groups. But there is no tension today. There is a little bit, but not serious tension. Now, if tomorrow, for some reason, there is the breakdown of the authority in Tehran, then you're going to see ethnic uprisings all over. Now, then the historians can begin to discuss, was that the cause of the breakdown? Mm-hmm. I would say no, it's the consequence of the breakdown. Right. Sectarianism is the consequence of the breakdown of the state. Now, how does Iran look at the Sunni Shiite? I have to tell you, I don't think Iran is that interested in pushing for this sectarian war. Not because they are good guys, but because they are too damn ambitious. They think if they play the card of sectarianism, they can only influence 20% of the Islamic
They're
world.
A minority.
They want to influence 100%. Yeah. Therefore, it is not to their interest to push this. Whereas for Saudi Arabia, it is to their interest to push this one. So for Iran, they're going to do everything they can to try to lower the level of sectarianism. This is why they have provided huge support to the two Sunni rejectionist Palestinian groups, Hamas and Jihad. These are not Shiites. These are Sunni groups. And that is, I think, an important point to make about Iranian perspective on that.
Although there is also, in the context of the Syrian war, a slight breakdown in that relationship between Iran and Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Next question, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Nizar Farsah from the Project on Middle East Democracy. I'm glad the discussion came to this point, because my question, I would like the panelists to a bit elaborate and be a bit more specific about what I perceive as the source. You seem to be very confident that the sectarianism that we're seeing is not going to be sustained, that ultimately things are going to revert to somehow a pluralistic society. And I'm wondering, what is the source of that confidence when you have precisely actors like Hezbollah who are showing and having generations of people who act in a way that's obviously very sectarian, where they're fighting for their sect and not necessarily for what is good for their country. Tunisians fighting in Syria rather than establishing the caliphate in Tunis. Palestinians, right, where we do not have Shia in Palestine, and one of the ways where Fatah was trying to undermine or delegitimize Hamas is saying that they are Shia, right? So I think the challenge is not in the powers that are manipulating the sectarianism, but in fact in the people that are buying into it, right? So the fact that people are starting to identify in those sectarian terms and feeling maybe that was what was wrong in the first place, that we should have all along have identified in our sect, and our sect is the best place for us to save ourselves. So my question is to the panelists, if they can elaborate more on why do they think that there is no staying power for that identification in the populace and not by the regional powers?
Who would like to take that? Greg, you look thoughtful.
I was keeping my eyes down so you wouldn't look at me. Look, sectarianism is, it's not going away in the Middle East. It's not going away in the United States of America. It's not going away in Europe. It's not going away anywhere. It's a question of how salient that identity is for your political life, right? And that salience goes up and down. We're in a situation, I think Mona is right, where things that might have happened from the top have now, kind of taken root in a way from the bottom up that is extremely dangerous and extremely violent, and makes it difficult to imagine how you get beyond that to the kinds of deals that could stabilize political life. But we do have evidence that it can happen in Lebanon, right? The reconstruction of Lebanese order was, and I'll let Paul and Kim talk about this because they know it better than I, it was imperfect, but at least people stopped killing each other. And then once you get people stopping killing each other, maybe then something else can happen. But I'm not optimistic that it happens in the short term.
Mona, would you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I would agree. My sense is, again, as I've said, I think this is a self-perpetuating dynamic, and therefore, in the short term, I think more likely than not, we're going to see a deepening of sectarianism, and frankly, I think it's going to shape various trajectories in the region, perhaps in ways that we can't even foresee at this point.
Where does education fit in? And I'm thinking of Syria, where until the civil war broke out, there was very little mention of sectarianism. It was all about coexistence. It was all about how no one thought that they were Sunni versus Alawite versus Christian. The government put a lot of emphasis on that. And in the end, we must remember that the majority in Syria is Sunni, I think 80%. So how does that work?
Well, I think education and, frankly, what will happen to what is now being termed a lost generation in Syria is going to be critical. Beyond the suffering of children in Syria, 1 million of whom are refugees, and the schools having been closed down, etc., you now do have the specter of Islamist extremist groups, jihadist groups, Salafist groups, imposing various types of education and, frankly, their ideology in schools on young children. And I think that in many ways can shape where this goes. And again, that's why I'm saying I think it's inordinately more complicated to roll this back. It's going to be quite difficult.
Mohsen wants to say something, and then we'll take the next question.
I think the single greatest case that has been interpreted in the West as victory for sectarianism was when 12er Shiism became state religion in Iran in 1501. Now, the conventional wisdom is that this was a sectarian war between the Ottoman Sunnis and the Persian Shiites. Well, this is not accurate. Yes, the Safavid used Shiism to push their agenda, but theological differences between the Sunnis and Shiites had nothing to do with this. In fact, at that time, Iran was a predominantly Sunni country. It was so predominantly Sunni that the Persian kings had to go to southern Lebanon, hence the importance of southern Lebanon for Iran. They had to go on and bring to Iran Arab clerics who didn't even speak Persian. So the point I'm trying to make, sectarianism, not seen in the context of power struggle for the supremacy of a state, is not that important. It is in that context that it becomes important.
All right. Please, sir, go ahead.
Hi, yes, my name is Darren Reese from the Institute for the Study of War. We've talked a little bit about sort of state collapse inside of borders and that no one's going to really have any interest in changing the legal borders. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to, this is sort of for the whole panel, but maybe Dr. Gause and Paul, about what happens when states lose control of those borders. And there are those that are trying to establish de facto, if not de jure, borders. I'm thinking in particular of the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, which has sort of spread itself across eastern Iraq, western Iraq, eastern Syria, and established, if not borders, nominal control in areas where the ISF can't control in Iraq and where there's no regime presence in Syria.
Paul?
Well, in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, the reality we are in, and we will be probably for the foreseeable future, is sectarian and ethnic zones that are at various levels of, self-rule. Yes, without much formalization, neither international borders nor, except rarely, like the KRG in some official federal system. And I think they will continue to be linked to regional proxy wars, sectarian, ethnic, and so on. The best that can be hoped for, I think, realistically, I'd hope for lovely things, but realistically, is to manage this mosaic. And the case of Lebanon is instructive. We had 16 years of civil war, and we're killing each other very rigorously, but we've had 23 years after that, still not forming a nation state that's sovereign. However, it's been peaceful, life has gone on for citizens, the economy has progressed, we've rebuilt. It's a way of muddling through. Iraq has not gotten there. There's still, whether it's from the Maliki government or others, an attempt to use force and power to, battle your way through. Obviously, Syria is not there at all. So I think we will be for the next maybe few decades in this, not Balkanized, but maybe Balkanized with a small b, a patchwork zone in which the regional powers should help manage and tamp down conflict until deeper changes might take place. I think sectarianism is with us for this generation and the next, but history also moves. The U.S. was, enslaved African Americans and then somehow elected an African American president. It took a long time. But history also moves in mysterious ways. We are not fated. The president of Syria in the 20s was a Christian for a moment. Nobody remarked upon it. It wasn't an issue. It has become an issue now, perhaps in 50 years, but it'll be a hell of a long time. Perhaps it won't be an issue.
Greg, do you want to say something?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. Let's take it from this side, please.
My name is Alexis Sapchenko. I'm a private citizen, and I apologize for repeating the questions which were asked before me, but it's going to be, I'll try to so the topic of this conference, of this panel, was Balkanization of Levant. And very quickly, the panel unanimously came to the conclusion that this is not a plausible scenario. And I would like to go back for the sake of worst-case scenario. What happens what will do Syrian Christians, Alawis, Shias, Druzes do if Al-Qaeda, pro-Al-Qaeda forces like al-Nusra and Islamic State of Iraq and Syria will take upper hand in Sunni areas? What will these non-Sunni actors do? Thank you.
Why don't you take that, please?
Again, I think the disposition of minorities in Syria is a big concern. It doesn't, to my mind, though, portend the redrawing of borders in the Balkanization in the sense of the term Balkanize means. But I think we're already seeing several trends. One is we're seeing not just from Syria and the Levant, but much more broadly from the Arab world. We're seeing Christians leaving the region because for them, I think for many of them, the Arab uprisings have not boded well for them. So that's one trend. The second is I think we're seeing in Syria ways in which minority communities are closing in upon themselves. I think the Druze are an excellent example of that in Syria, where they are very much sort of solidified in the Jabal Druze in Suwaida in the southern areas of south of Damascus. And I think this is kind of along the lines of what Paul was describing, this idea of a patchwork of enclaves, which was also the case in Lebanon for some years. And I think that that's unfortunately where Syria is headed. But not the creation of statelets. These are not entities that are self-sufficient, and you're not going to have an Alawistan with its own capital and flag, and nor will you have a Jabal Druze that's its own separate sovereign entity. That I just don't think it's feasible.
And yet, when articles talking about the redrawing of maps are published in the Western press, it is seen back in the region as proof that there is a plot to divide the region, which then feeds its own dynamic, and that's quite interesting. Let's take the last two questions together so that we can wrap up and get a little bit from everyone on the panel. Please go ahead.
Yeah. My name is Anthony Odi. I'm a consultant for the World Bank. Dr. Milani started the ball rolling on discussion of potential US-Iranian rapprochement. I wondered if we could imagine playing the ball a bit further down the field and ask which issues potentially on the table might we expect some progress, whether it's substantive or lowering temperatures, and which issues really would be very stubborn and difficult for them to get anywhere with.
And are you talking specifically about the nuclear agreement? Or
no, I'm talking about
in general.
In general, issues on the table, projecting almost, let's suppose we make progress with nuclear, where else could we go, where might we not go?
All right. And question here, please.
Yes, my name is Safi Hamid. I'm a professor with Chatham University, and I would like to thank the panel for a very penetrating and diverse opinions and views. I have some reservation or a point to raise about use of terminology. A term which has been used several times, the jihadi. And, since we are in a very scholarly stage here, I guess any educated Muslim around the Muslim world will look at the word jihadi not as a dirty word, but it is actually a very noble word. While, of course, the mass media here probably have, since September 11, stereotyped this word. So I would like to ask the question, I'm trying to avoid, of course, creating the myth and following it, so all our calculations and our policies and our studies will be distorted or tainted by the myth we created ourselves. To many scholars of Islam, jihad is a spectrum of activism. Spectrum of activism starts with maybe speaking or writing and ending up with social welfare work all over the place. And at the end of it, at the end of the spectrum, there is military resistance. But the way I felt hearing it in this panel, that it is the boogeyman, that if we don't find solutions for sectarianism, we will end up with jihadists taking over. And I would take an issue with that. Thanks.
Sectarianism is on all sides, of course. We have sectarianism being used by Christian right-wing groups in Lebanon as well. So I will ask Mohsen to answer the question about Iran and what issues the US and Iran might make progress on and what might be the sticking points. If you could keep it a little bit brief, we're going to try to get both answers in before the end of the panel.
I can think of 4 very specific and concrete areas where the two countries can collaborate and have mutual benefit. First is in Afghanistan, especially with the withdrawal of American troops starting in next December. I think the two countries do have a common goal of preventing Al-Qaeda and the Taliban having strong presence in Afghanistan. I think the second area, regional area, is on Iraq. The two countries have a great deal of commonality about the future of Iraq, and I think they can work together. And if it works in Iraq, it takes us to the third area, and that is oil and gas, especially gas. Iran has the second largest natural gas reserves in the world. Iran is involved in having a number of pipelines going from Persian Gulf to Pakistan, and another one going to the Mediterranean through Iraq. The U.S. can get involved in this, and the two can work collaboratively. And I think that is a very important development in terms of energy security. And finally, I think on Syria, the two countries, despite their disagreements, share two common objectives. One, neither one wants to see a complete breakdown of the Syrian state. I am not sure if other players in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, see it the same way. Secondly, I think the two countries want to oppose the jihadists and I'm using the word that is being used in the literature here, the extremists and the allied, the affiliated groups that have become empowered in Syria. Both countries can work together to eliminate the region from the danger of these extremist groups.
Mohsen, Hezbollah, the key sticking point, yes or no?
I think the question of Hezbollah for Iran, because it is the most important issue, Iran will be willing to discuss it only after they have built quite a bit of confidence with the U.S. At this time, I don't think it's on the table.
Paul, you wanted to say something on this as well,
I think
briefly.
there could be a link between, maybe what the U.S. and Iran might or may not agree on, and what really destabilizes the Middle East. I mean, the fact of the matter is Iran today supports an exclusionary regime in Baghdad, which after the U.S. withdrawal has done its best to effectively exclude a major community. In Syria, they are standing fast by a sadistic regime which has butchered its population and completely ruined Syria and is an open-ended butchery. And in Lebanon, they happily support a non-state actor which completely dominates the state, has no respect really for, the Lebanese state, the Lebanese people, and so on. Now, all of this has been done previously with the justification that Iran is under threat, the revolution is under threat from the U.S. and Israel, so this is a defensive, Hezbollah is there to deter, Syria is there as a deterrence and an ally and this and that. And this, links back to what has aggravated the Arab world, the Sunni world, and so on. Iran definitely has outstretched itself illegitimately in ways that are clear, that are unacceptable by normal standards. And if, nuclear talks or not is an opportunity for Iran to rethink, recalibrate, retreat effectively from these very aggressive and I would say, unjustifiable in a normal context, that is a way to begin to repair Iranian-Arab relations. But the way it is now in these three states and Iran's clear policies, yes, I agree that there is in Iranian thinking the wish that if we could only reach out to the whole Muslim world, and after the 2006 war, that was a time, and indeed Ahmadinejad and Nasrallah were the most popular leaders in the Sunni world, according to all. But it's the fact, that when push came to shove, they stood with the sect in Iraq, the sect in Syria, and the sect in Lebanon, and they're responsible for those policies and for the blowback against those policies.
Mona, would you like to address this? But also I wanted to have an answer for the gentleman who talked about the term jihadis, and perhaps you could expand a little bit and talk about whether there are preconceived ideas in the West about, what people are depending on what they look like. I remember that there was a lot of alarm looking at fighters in Syria and thinking, well, they have beards, they must be Islamists, they must be radical, they're not liberal, they're not like us. Is that justified? Is it not? And do you think that the word jihadi is being misused?
I think jihadi is often thrown around loosely, and I certainly take the questioner's point about the fact that there is a jihadist encompasses a spectrum that can be spiritual all the way up to violent. And I do think for sure, and it has been said, that there are many rebel groups, rebels who may take on the appearance, whether it's the beards, whether it's the dress, whatever it is, of a Salafist or a more radical Islamist, that may be part and parcel of the sea in which they swim, rather than an indication of some sort of deep ideological attachment to the idea of violent jihad.
Or the lack of time to shave every day.
No. As well.
Middle of
Christian fighters in Lebanon in the middle of the war didn't look that different, actually.
But that said, I do think there absolutely is a violent jihadist element operating in Syria today that espouses an ideology that is transnational in scope, that looks to reestablish the sort of caliphate, and which one really can't ignore, particularly if we understand that we are actually seeing an increase in the number of foreign fighters who espouse this ideology coming to Syria, and I think that absolutely can't be ignored and potentially has implications going forward.
We're going to wrap up the panel. I'm going to ask one last question. I want 30-second answers from each one of you, your favorite way of ending a panel. 10 years from now, what does the Levant look like? Greg. 30 seconds. You can do it.
I have no idea, but the international borders will be the same as they are today.
Mohsen?
I am not going to make a fool out of myself.
And neither am I. I mean, I would parrot exactly what Greg said. I just think we don't know.
Continued strife?
Yes.
I mean, of course we can't know of, that's obvious, but to be, attempt to be, useful in the way we think about. I think that the, likely scenario is, as we've been all saying, a fractured, both ethnically and sectarian, and 10 years is not a long time. 10 years is, a few months, basically, strung together. I don't see any major changes, from Iran or Saudi Arabia or the international community. Hence, I see probably a region that is, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon remain fragmented, troubled. I hope and I expect that perhaps the level of enormous conflict would have been damped down. That perhaps, like in Lebanon, the Lebanese Civil War, the first 2 years we really went at it, and then we cooled it for 16 years, but it still was a on and off civil war, but not a lot of people were being killed. So I hope that at least we would calm the present mess.
Greg has come up with a rebuttal.
I do think that if there's one place 10 years from now that might look better in terms of having a more coherent state and a state that is more inclusive in terms of citizenship, I think it might be Iraq. Because Iraq has the money to build, has the potential for money to build that state. And I think that state institutions in Iraq, the bureaucratic state, is being somewhat reconstructed. I'm not talking about the KRG, just Arab Iraq. But I think that if there's one place in 10 years that might look better than it does today, it might be Iraq.
All right. Greg, Mohsen, Mona, and Paul, thank you very much for your interventions, and thank you all for joining us for this panel. Thank you very much.